For one long beat, Ethan said nothing. The silence on the executive floor changed shape around him, no longer polished, no longer obedient. It became watchful. Richard Vale gave a quiet laugh, the kind meant to shrink another person without anyone having to admit it happened. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, adjusting the edge of his cuff, "the press from Bloomberg and MarketWatch are already in place. We really should not let building staff create confusion right before the signing." Naomi did not react to the word staff. She stood beside her cart with the stillness of someone who had learned that the rich often mistook quiet for emptiness. A spray bottle of glass cleaner caught the pale morning light. A ring of dampness darkened the mop head in the yellow bucket below. The clean scent of lemon and bleach hung in the air, cutting through the darker smell of coffee drifting from the boardroom. Ethan looked at Naomi again, more carefully now, as if irritation alone might explain why her words had lodged in his chest. "What exactly are you accusing my executives of?" he asked. Naomi glanced once toward the glass conference room, where the board members were settling in with the nervous precision of people who knew cameras would soon be invited inside. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I did not accuse anyone," she said softly. "I told you your brother did not do what they said he did." Richard's expression tightened for the first time. Only slightly. But Ethan saw it. It was gone a second later, smoothed over with the same practiced calm Richard used in investor calls and regulatory meetings and family funerals. "This is absurd," Richard said. "She is repeating gossip she could not possibly understand." Naomi lowered her gaze, but not in surrender. More like restraint. "I understand more than you think, sir." The words were simple. The effect was not. Ethan felt the old name rise in him before he could stop it. Caleb. It moved through his mind like a draft through a house no one had opened in years. Caleb Whitmore, his younger brother, had once been the bright one, the charming one, the son their father laughed with instead of instructing. Then the money went missing. Then the internal audit surfaced. Then the shame arrived in neat binders and whispered headlines, and a father whose heart had not survived the winter that followed. Ethan had spent 3 years turning grief into control, control into growth, and growth into the kind of company no one could pity. He did not allow cracks. He certainly did not take warnings from a cleaner standing in orthopedic shoes outside a room full of reporters. And yet the name in his head would not quiet down. Naomi shifted her hand from the cart handle to the folded stack of microfiber cloths on the top shelf, aligning their edges with absent precision. It was such a small movement, but Ethan noticed how steady her fingers were. No fidgeting, no performance. Only composure. "You need to leave this floor," Richard said, his voice cooling now that charm had failed. Immediately, Naomi nodded once, as though she had expected that from the start. She reached into the breast pocket of her maintenance polo and pulled out a plain white envelope, slightly worn at the corners. No logo. No label beyond one name written in blue ink. Whitmore. She did not offer it to Richard. She held it toward Ethan. "If you read this before you sign," she said, "you still have time." Ethan stared at the envelope without taking it. Through the glass behind him, someone inside the boardroom rose and closed the door halfway, sealing in the shine of polished wood, blue ties, silver pitchers of water, and the deal he had spent 6 months building. In the reflection, he could see himself standing between two worlds, the bright room where everyone agreed with him, and the service corridor where a quiet woman with cleaning solution on her gloves was asking him, with nothing but paper and nerve, to remember the brother he had buried long before the man himself disappeared. Ethan took the envelope at last, not because he trusted her, but because refusing it in front of Richard suddenly felt like the more dangerous choice. The paper was warm from Naomi's hand, light as almost nothing, and yet it seemed to pull the weight of the entire morning into his palm. Richard stepped closer at once, his cologne sharp and expensive, his smile back in place but thinner now. "Sir, I strongly recommend we handle whatever this is through legal after the signing," he said. "You do not want to let an unverified distraction derail a $700 million acquisition." Ethan did not answer. His thumb pressed along the unsealed edge of the envelope, but he did not open it yet. Instead, he looked at Naomi, really looked this time, and the strange thing was not that she appeared defiant. It was that she did not. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction, no thrill at having interrupted a man whose calendar was usually measured in 5-minute blocks and private flights. She looked tired, composed, and older than her employee file had suggested. 29, if he remembered correctly. Night maintenance, 6 months. No disciplinary notes. No complaints. Always on time. The kind of record people praised without ever learning the person attached to it. Where did you get this? He asked. Naomi glanced down the corridor toward the service elevator, where a red exit sign glowed over brushed steel doors. From a place no one important has looked in a long time, she said. Richard exhaled through his nose, just enough to show annoyance. This is ridiculous. But Ethan barely heard him. Something in Naomi's wording landed with the quiet weight of lived truth. No one important. He thought of the old storage levels beneath the building, the locked file rooms from the years before digitization, the spaces scheduled for renovation and then forgotten because newer crises always arrived first. Whitmore Global had been built on polished surfaces and private assurances, but underneath it was still an old company, full of sealed cabinets, archived ledgers, and things men assumed would stay buried simply because the people most likely to notice them were paid not to speak. Naomi seemed to understand that world in a way he never had. Her cleaning cart stood between them like an inventory of invisibility, latex gloves, lint-free cloths, a half-full jug of floor solution, a trash liner folded with military neatness, a small roll of replacement labels, tools for restoring order after people with titles had passed through and left their mess behind. Ethan had never once wondered who moved through his office after midnight. Never wondered who straightened the chairs after board fights, who erased coffee rings from the conference table, who emptied the bins where failed drafts and careless printouts ended up. Yet standing there with the envelope in his hand, he found himself thinking that a woman who cleaned up after executives probably knew more about them than executives knew about themselves. Naomi shifted slightly, and the overhead light caught the scarred edge of one knuckle above her glove, the faint wear at the hem of her sleeve, the careful way she carried herself, as if any extra motion might invite a judgment she had no energy left to absorb. Why are you doing this? Ethan asked. Her answer came without delay. Because your brother was not the only person who paid for what happened. The words settled between them, low and devastating. Richard's expression changed first. Not fear exactly. More like calculation under pressure. Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle tilt in the room when truth entered before anyone was ready. Through the half-closed glass doors, the boardroom lights gleamed across polished walnut and crystal water glasses, waiting for him. Behind Naomi, the service hallway stretched plain and narrow, smelling faintly of lemon, paper dust, and old air. 2 worlds. One of them had taught him how to lead. The other, he was beginning to realize, had been watching him all along. Richard recovered first. Men like him always did. Ethan had seen it in courtrooms, earnings calls, and family condolences delivered beside polished caskets. The ones who feared exposure most were often the quickest to smooth their tie and speak as if nothing at all had shifted. Mr. Whitmore, he said, voice measured, almost gentle now. The board is waiting, the cameras are staged, and your legal team has spent weeks on this close. You cannot hand the fate of the company to a rumor passed through a service corridor. Naomi did not flinch at the phrase. She simply lowered her hand from the top of the cart and folded both gloved hands in front of her, as if bracing herself against a wind no one else could feel. Ethan looked down at the envelope again. The blue ink of his last name had been written carefully, not by a clerk, not by someone rushing through a task, but by a person who had held the paper long enough to understand what it might cost to hand it over. Beyond the glass, the boardroom door opened wider and a member of the communications team stepped out, headset on, smile already fixed in place for the press. 2 minutes, sir, she said brightly. Then she noticed Naomi, the cart, the stillness in the air, and her smile faltered just enough to reveal the discomfort beneath it. Ethan gave a short nod, and she disappeared back inside. The floor fell quiet again. He slid one finger under the flap and pulled out a folded sheet, then another. The first page was a photocopy of an old internal memo dated nearly 4 years earlier, from the weeks before Caleb's disgrace had become public. Ethan recognized the company letterhead immediately. He also recognized his father's handwriting in the margin, dark and forceful, underlining one sentence twice. Review transfer authorizations from Vale office. Do not file yet. Ethan's pulse changed. Not faster. Stranger. He flipped to the second page. It was a printout of an inventory log from Building Sublevel B, Archive Room 3. Box removed. Box returned. Box removed again 6 days later. No executive signature. No final record. The date on the log was the same week Caleb had been accused of moving funds through an unauthorized shell vendor. Ethan stared at the pages, and for the first time that morning the conference room, the cameras, the acquisition, all of it blurred at the edges. A memory rose without warning. Caleb at 26, tie crooked, laughed too easy for a Whitmore, standing in their father's office with both palms open and saying, "I did not do this, Ethan. You know I am careless, not dishonest." Ethan had not answered him that night. He had looked at the audit figures, at their father's grave face, at the raw humiliation sinking through the house like weather, and he had chosen silence because silence felt cleaner than doubt. Richard was speaking again, but his voice seemed farther away now. Anyone could have forged that memo. Anyone could have taken old storage records and made them sound suspicious. Naomi finally spoke, her voice quiet enough that Ethan had to turn slightly to hear it. "I found the box behind a sealed vent in the old records room. It was wrapped in janitor bags and pushed so far back only someone cleaning for mold treatment would have seen it." Her words were plain, but the picture they created was not. Hidden documents. Maintenance levels. Trash bags. Not shredded. Not destroyed. Just hidden where people with polished shoes would never crouch low enough to look. Ethan lifted his eyes to her face. "Why did you keep digging?" he asked. Naomi held his gaze for one brief second, and in that second he saw something beyond caution. Something older. "Because my mother used to work in this building," she said. "And the week your brother was blamed, she came home crying, and said a man in a gray suit told her some truths stay buried, because no one listens to women pushing cleaning carts." Richard went still. It was not dramatic. That was what made it terrifying. No protest. No scoff. Just a silence too exact to be innocent. And Ethan, standing between the bright room built on appearances and the narrow hallway that smelled of bleach and old paper, understood with sudden cold clarity that the most dangerous sentence of his morning had not been whispered by the quietest person on the floor. It had been the one he had told himself for years. Caleb did it. Now, with his father's handwriting in one hand and Naomi's steadiness in front of him, that sentence no longer felt solid. It felt convenient. The boardroom door opened again, this time with more urgency. A legal associate stepped out, clutching a tablet against his chest, and the glow from the room spilled across the marble floor in a clean white stripe. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral, "the investors are asking whether we should begin." Ethan did not answer right away. He was still looking at the memo in his hand, at his father's impatient handwriting carved into the margin like a warning that had been forced underground before it could breathe. "Review transfer authorizations from Vale office. Do not file yet." The words felt less like a note and more like a hand reaching forward through the years. Late, but not too late. Richard stepped in before the silence could harden against him. "We begin," he said smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore will join you in a moment." Ethan lifted his head. "No," he said. It was a quiet word, but it struck the corridor with the force of something final. The associate blinked. Richard turned, careful, almost smiling. "I am sorry." Ethan folded the papers once, not to hide them, but to keep his hands from tightening. "I said no. Delay the signing." The associate's face lost color. Behind the glass walls, the board members were visible in fragments now, shoulders shifting, cups being lifted and set down, private impatience arranging itself into public concern. Richard let out a slow breath, the kind men use when they want everyone nearby to understand how deeply reasonable they are being. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice into something personal, almost paternal, "whatever history this woman has dragged up, this is not the time to indulge it. Do not sabotage your father's company because a cleaner found old paper in a basement." Naomi's gaze did not move, but Ethan felt the sentence land beside them like a stain spreading through water. A cleaner. Old paper. Basement. The language of dismissal was always so neat. It turned people into function and truth into clutter. Ethan had spoken that language himself for years without noticing its cost. He looked past Richard to Naomi's cart, to the roll of black trash liners, the bottle of disinfectant with the label peeling at one corner, the gray microfiber cloth folded into an exact square. The things on that card had touched every surface he considered his world. They had wiped away fingerprints, coffee drips, dust, evidence of human carelessness. How much had he trusted polished rooms while ignoring the people who polished them? "Where's the rest of it?" he asked. Naomi hesitated just long enough for him to understand that the question mattered. "Locked in the old maintenance records closet on sublevel B," she said. "I put it back after I copied these. I was afraid if I carried too much out at once, someone would notice." Richard gave a soft laugh that was almost admirable in its control. "Listen to this. She is admitting she tampered with company archives." Naomi finally looked at him then, and there was no anger in her face, only something far more difficult to meet. Weariness. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I am admitting I noticed what other people chose not to." Ethan felt that one in his chest. The legal associate by the door shifted from one foot to the other, unsure whether to leave, stay, or disappear. The floor hummed faintly beneath them with the distant machinery of elevators and climate control. Somewhere farther down the hall, a printer started and stopped. Normal sounds. Corporate sounds. The kind that made it easy to believe the world stayed orderly because men in tailored suits kept it that way. Ethan folded the pages again and handed them back to no one. He kept them. "Clear the room," he told the associate. "Tell the board there is a delay." The young man opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded and vanished behind the glass. Richard's composure thinned at last. Not broken, just stretched. "This is reckless," he said. Ethan turned to him fully now. "Maybe," he replied, "but not as reckless as building a future on something my father was trying to stop." Then he looked at Naomi, at the woman he had barely seen until 10 minutes ago, standing beneath fluorescent light, with cleaning solution on her gloves and more courage in her silence than most executives managed with a microphone. "You are coming with me," he said. Naomi did not smile. She only gave one small nod, the kind a person gives when they have already carried the weight of being disbelieved and know better than to celebrate too early. Richard took half a step forward. "Ethan." But Ethan had already turned away from the boardroom and toward the service elevator, toward the lower levels of the building, toward dust, locked cabinets, old air, and whatever truth had waited all these years in the one place men like Richard assumed no one important would ever go. The service elevator arrived with a dull mechanical sigh, its brushed steel doors parting onto a narrower world than Ethan Whitmore had entered in years. No glass walls, no skyline, no waiting cameras or polished conference tables. Just fluorescent light, pale and unforgiving, flattening everything it touched. Naomi wheeled her card in first, the front caster clicking once over the metal threshold. Ethan followed, still holding the folded pages in one hand. Behind them, Richard stopped at the elevator bank, but did not step inside. He kept one palm on the closing door, as if proximity alone might preserve control. "You are making a mistake," he said. His voice was low now, stripped of performance. "If you walk into archive storage with her instead of into that boardroom, you will hand your enemies a story they will never stop telling." Ethan looked at him without expression. "Then they can tell it accurately." Richard's hand slipped away as the doors closed. The elevator began its descent with a soft shudder, and for the first time that morning Ethan found himself in a silence that felt honest. The mirrored back panel reflected him beside Naomi in a way the executive floors never had before. His dark suit still sat perfectly on his frame, every line expensive, every detail controlled. Beside him stood a woman in a maintenance polo with a utility key ring clipped at her hip and a faint streak of dust near the cuff of one glove. The contrast should have looked absurd. Instead it looked revealing. Naomi kept her eyes on the glowing floor numbers as they dropped past lobby, parking, storage, service. Ethan studied the side of her face, the stillness in it, the care with which she occupied space as if she had spent years making herself smaller so other people could remain comfortable. "Why did you not bring this to compliance?" he asked. Naomi gave a soft breath that was not quite a laugh. "Because the last time my family trusted an office with frosted glass and a title on the door, nothing changed except who got punished." The elevator hummed lower. Ethan waited. Naomi's fingers rested lightly on the card handle. "My mother worked here for 11 years, she said. Night shift, mostly executive levels. She knew which men stayed late, which assistants cried in the copy room, which doors got locked when they should not have been. She did not mean to find anything. She just noticed things because cleaning means seeing what people leave behind. Ethan felt the truth of that immediately. He thought of the things he himself had left behind without a second glance. Drafts, notes, call sheets, handwritten figures, careless assumptions. Naomi went on, her voice even. The week your brother was blamed. She came home with red eyes and said a box from old finance records had been moved through the maintenance corridor twice in one night. She said a man in a gray suit saw her notice and asked whether she planned to make herself a problem. Ethan did not need her to name him. Richard had worn gray almost every day for a decade. Why did your mother not come forward? Naomi looked down at the yellow caution sign folded into the side of her cart. Because she was a black woman with a cleaning badge and 2 past due utility bills in a city where important people only heard workers when they wanted coffee or silence. The words were not bitter. That made them harder to escape. They were simply true. The elevator reached sublevel. Be with a soft ding. When the doors opened, cold air met them first, carrying the smell of concrete dust, old cardboard, machine oil, and something faintly metallic from the boiler room farther down the hall. The corridor was dimmer here, the lights farther apart, leaving pockets of shadow between locked storage doors and exposed pipes wrapped in aging insulation. Naomi stepped out and guided the cart left, wheels rattling over the unfinished floor. Ethan followed, hearing each footstep echo back at him from painted cinder block walls. Halfway down the corridor, Naomi stopped in front of a narrow gray door with a rusted placard that read maintenance records. She reached to the key ring at her hip and paused. Not from fear exactly, more from memory. My mother told me something the last month she was alive, she said quietly, her hand resting on the key. She said rich people do not hide the truth where it is hardest to get to. They hide it where they believe no one important will ever look. Then she slid the key into the lock, and Ethan, standing in the cold hum of the underbelly of his own building, understood that he was about to open not just a door, but the part of his family's story that had been kept in the dark by everyone he had once been taught to trust. The lock turned with a dry metallic click, followed by the reluctant scrape of a door that had not been opened in months. Naomi pulled it inward, and a breath of stale air rolled out, cool and papery, carrying the smell of dust, cardboard, and old toner. The room beyond was smaller than Ethan expected, barely wider than a walk-in closet. Its ceiling crossed with exposed pipe and conduit, its single fluorescent tube buzzing faintly overhead. Metal shelves lined 3 walls from floor to shoulder height, sagging under banker boxes, maintenance manuals, outdated vendor binders, and file trays with handwritten labels fading to ghost gray. Everything looked forgotten. That, Ethan realized at once, was the point. Naomi stepped inside first and reached up to flick the light fully on. The bulb steadied, then flattened the room into a hard pale wash. She did not go to the front shelf. She crossed straight to the far wall, crouched beside the lowest row, and slid aside a stack of unopened air filter cartons. Behind them, nearly flush against the concrete, was a vent cover with one corner scratched brighter than the rest. Ethan stood at the threshold watching her remove 2 screws from the grill with a stubby maintenance driver she drew from the side pocket of her cart. The motion was practiced. Careful, not theatrical. She set the screws in a neat line on the floor and pulled the vent cover free. Behind it was darkness, then plastic, then the squared edge of a box wrapped in black janitor bags and sealed with aging clear tape. Ethan felt his pulse shift again. Naomi turned her face toward him. This is where I found it, she said. I put it back exactly the way it was. Ethan stepped closer and lowered himself to one knee on the cold concrete, the crease of his trousers pressing against dust he would have once noticed immediately. Now he did not care. Naomi eased the box out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. He could hear something inside shift with a muted knock. Not loose papers, something denser. She set it between them. The black bags were clean except for one thin ribbon of plaster dust, as if the box had been pushed into the vent during renovation work years ago and never touched again. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then peeled back the tape. The sound was small, but in the cramped room it seemed to echo. Layer by layer, the plastic opened. Underneath was a standard archive box, off-white once, now yellowed at the edges, with old finance department labels half torn from the side. One word remained legible in faded marker. Interim. Ethan lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with unsettling care, were 3 ledger folders, a microcassette recorder in a zip bag, 2 mini tapes labeled only by date, and a thick manila envelope secured with a brass clasp. Naomi did not touch any of it. She only watched him, giving the box the same respect people give graves and evidence. Ethan picked up the top folder first. The cover sheet bore Caleb's employee authorization number. His stomach tightened. Beneath it were transfer logs, vendor summaries, and routing slips. But something was wrong. The signatures looked right until they did not. His father's initials, Caleb's approval marks, Richard's countersignature. Familiar. Yet the dates staggered in a way that made no procedural sense, as though one version of the story had been laid on top of another by someone who understood just enough about internal controls to fake consistency. Ethan flipped faster. Duplicate pages. Missing timestamp pages. A routing sheet signed before the supporting invoice existed. He stopped breathing for a second. Naomi's voice came quietly from beside him. That is what made me keep looking. Ethan set the folder down and reached for the manila envelope. Inside was a typed memo draft with red pen corrections in his father's hand, a printed chain of internal emails, and a photograph. The photograph was grainy, taken from a distance through what looked like wired glass, but the faces were still clear enough. Richard Vale, younger by a few years, stood in the maintenance corridor outside Old Records with a storage dolly. Beside him, head turned half away, was Ethan's father. And on the dolly, unmistakable even in the bad light, sat this same box. Ethan looked at the date stamped in the lower corner. It was 2 nights before Caleb had been blamed for everything. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, sharp and insect-like, and in that cramped little room beneath his own company, with dust on his knee and old lies in his hands, Ethan understood that suspicion was no longer a feeling. It was beginning to take the shape of proof. Ethan set the photograph down with more care than he had picked it up, as if sudden movement might somehow blur the faces and return him to the cleaner, simpler lie he had lived with for 4 years. The little records room felt smaller now, its stale air pressing close, the fluorescent light washing every object in a colorless honesty that left no room for comfort. Naomi remained crouched across from him, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the box, not touching the files, not rushing him, simply holding the silence steady while he caught up to what she had already understood. Ethan reached for the microcassette recorder next. It was older than anything still used in the building, a dull black rectangle with a scratched clear window and a strip of masking tape across the back. No label, just age. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the grit caught in the seams, and for a strange second, he pictured his father's study at home, the one room in the Whitmore house that had always smelled of leather chairs, copier toner, and cold coffee long after midnight. His father used to dictate notes when he was too tired to write. Legal reminders, financial concerns, things he did not trust memory to hold. Ethan swallowed once and looked up at Naomi. "Did you listen to it?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Only enough to know I was not imagining what the papers suggested." That answer, restrained and exact, made Ethan trust her more than any dramatic speech could have. He pressed the play button. At first there was only static, then the soft mechanical hiss of old tape moving through worn parts, and then his father's voice, thinner than Ethan remembered, older, but unmistakable. "If this is the version I am keeping, then I was right the first time." Caleb did not authorize the second transfer. Richard altered the routing chain after review. Ethan went completely still. The room did not just quiet. It deepened. Even the hum above them seemed to recede. On the tape, there was a sound of paper shifting. Then his father again, lower now, tired in a way Ethan had never let himself hear before. "I should have stopped this earlier. If something happens before I can fix it, the maintenance corridor camera from April 12th matters. Do not let them bury the archive box. Do not let them bury Caleb with it." Ethan closed his eyes. The words struck with none of the chaos of an accusation. That was what made them devastating. They did not shout. They confirmed. When he opened his eyes again, the room looked the same, but he did not. Naomi watched him carefully, not with pity, but with the solemn patience of someone who knew some truths arrive like light and others like weight. Ethan clicked the recorder off. His hand was steady only because everything inside him had gone cold. "He knew," he said, though he was not sure whether he meant his father or himself. Naomi's voice came softly. I think he was trying to find a way to say it that powerful people would believe. Ethan looked down at the papers scattered inside the box, at the ledger sheets, the faded labels, the evidence hidden behind a vent in a maintenance room beneath the company whose future he had been about to celebrate upstairs. His future. Richard's voice returned to him in memory, smooth and practical, always ready with a reason, a delay, a cleaner explanation than doubt. Ethan had called that loyalty. His father had called it something else on a tape no one was meant to hear too late. A vibration pulsed suddenly against Ethan's palm. His phone. He pulled it from his jacket pocket. 9 missed calls. 3 from the board chair. 2 from legal. 4 from Richard. A new message flashed across the screen from communications. Press wants statement now. Delay is causing concern. Ethan stared at the words and felt, for the first time in years, how small the upper floors really were. All that glass, all that status, all that choreography, and none of it had been strong enough to hold one honest sentence once it entered the room. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without replying. Then he looked at Naomi, at the woman whose badge had opened the one door everyone important had passed over, and he understood that the most dangerous part of this story was no longer what Richard had done. It was what Ethan had allowed himself not to see. Ethan moved with sudden purpose after that, not the polished urgency of a man late to a board meeting, but the stripped-down focus of someone trying to outrun his own years of certainty. He slid the microcassette recorder, the photograph, and the memo back into the archive box, leaving the ledgers open long enough to pull 3 pages that mattered most. Naomi watched him without interruption. She did not ask what he believed now. She seemed to understand that belief was no longer the problem. Proof was. Ethan took out his phone again and opened the secure internal directory, scrolling past dozens of names he usually trusted on instinct. This time instinct felt cheap. He bypassed legal, bypassed communications, bypassed the board chair. Instead, he called Lena Ortiz, the head of internal systems audit, a woman his father had once described as annoyingly honest, which in Whitmore language had always meant useful when things got ugly. She answered on the second ring, her voice clipped and alert. I am in the middle of a very unhappy board, she said. You should be. Ethan kept his tone flat. I need you off the record for the next 15 minutes. Pull archive corridor footage from April 12th, for years ago. Maintenance corridor outside, old records. Also pull any access logs tied to sublevel B, archive room 3, and do not alert finance. There was a pause on the line, then the sound of keys moving fast. That footage should have been purged, she said. Then tell me if it was, Ethan replied. Naomi was already rewrapping the box with the same black janitor bags, not to hide it again, but to move it without drawing attention. Her hands were efficient, almost tender with the evidence. The room buzzed softly around them, stale air and humming light, while Ethan stood there listening to Lena breathe through the silence on the other end. This is interesting, she said at last. The footage was marked for deletion, but the deletion failed. There is a mirrored fragment in legacy storage. It is low resolution. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. His father had known. Even the system had tried to remember. Send it to my private device only. Done. And Ethan, Lena added, her voice changing now, less procedural, more human. There is something else. Archive Room 3 access was overridden that same night using a temporary executive badge clone. Registered origin says finance operations. Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. Assigned to whom? More keys. A breath. The clone was generated off Richard Vale's credential tree. The words landed cleanly, almost gently, and that gentleness made them brutal. Ethan looked at Naomi. She met his eyes, and in her face he saw no surprise, only the quiet ache of someone who had carried truth alone for too long to mistake confirmation for relief. His phone chimed with an incoming file. Ethan opened the video. Grainy corridor. Timestamp flickering in one corner. Maintenance hallway. Concrete floor. Then movement. Richard, younger but unmistakable, appeared pushing a dolly with the same box. Seconds later, Ethan's father entered frame, shoulders tense, one hand raised as if arguing. There was no audio, but there was enough. Richard gesturing toward the service door. His father stepping in front of the dolly. The frame skipping once. Then both men gone. The timestamp jumped 11 minutes. Richard returned alone. No dolly. No box. Ethan stared until the pixels blurred. He had spent years believing Caleb's fall had broken his father. Now a worse possibility took shape. Maybe the truth had broken him first. Naomi lowered her gaze to the cart for a moment, then said quietly, "There is one more tape." Ethan looked up. She nodded toward the box. "I did not listen to all of it. I thought that part belonged to family." Family. The word struck him with an almost unbearable softness. For years he had defended the company by sacrificing the people inside it. Caleb, his father. Even the idea of loyalty had been handed over to the wrong man. Ethan reached for the second mini tape and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he lifted the box himself. It was heavier than before, not because the contents had changed, but because now he knew exactly what they meant. He turned toward the door. "We are going upstairs," he said. Naomi's eyes flicked to the wrapped evidence, then back to his face. "To the board?" she asked. Ethan held the box against his chest and shook his head once. "No," he said. "First to my father's office. I think he left me one last chance to stop protecting the wrong person." The ride back up felt longer than the descent, perhaps because Ethan was no longer moving toward uncertainty, but toward memory. He carried the archive box himself, both hands under its weight, while Naomi stood beside the cart in the service elevator with the same quiet steadiness that had brought them this far. Neither of them spoke. The fluorescent light above buzzed softly. The mirrored panel reflected a man in a tailored suit holding a cardboard box wrapped in black janitor bags, as though it contained the bones of his own history, and beside him, a woman in a maintenance uniform whose name he had barely noticed until she became the only honest voice in the building. When the doors opened onto the executive level again, the contrast hit him all at once. Warm recessed lighting, thick carpet that swallowed footsteps, glass walls polished clear enough to look invisible. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed too quickly, the brittle kind of sound people use when they sense trouble but do not yet know its shape. Ethan did not turn toward the boardroom. He went the other direction, past the framed awards, past the private meeting lounge, toward the corner office that still bore his father's name on a brushed brass plaque no one had yet had the nerve to remove. Naomi followed without question, wheeling the cart behind him. The quiet rattle of its wheels across the carpeted threshold sounded almost wrong, like a truth entering a room built to keep such things out. Ethan unlocked the office himself. The door opened onto a stillness that had survived him. Dark walnut shelves, leather chairs that still carried faint creases from use, a decanter untouched for years. The city spread beyond the windows in silver winter light, but inside the room the air held another time entirely, the lingering scent of paper, cedar, and old coffee. He set the box on the low table by the sofa and stood there for a moment, unable to move. Naomi remained near the door, respectful, almost ready to leave if he asked. Ethan crossed to the desk instead. He had not sat behind it since the funeral, had not opened the left drawer where his father kept private memos and emergency contacts written by hand, because he trusted ink more than systems. His fingers hesitated on the brass pull, then opened it. Inside were 3 fountain pens, an old glasses case, 2 sealed envelopes, and a small tape adapter still in its original packaging. Ethan stared at it, then let out a breath so quiet it barely counted. His father had planned for someone to listen. Beneath the adapter sat a folded note in the same blunt handwriting as the margin annotation from the memo. "If you are hearing this too late, do not let shame make you cowardly." Ethan read it twice. The room blurred for a second, then steadied again. Naomi had stepped closer now, not intruding, just present. That presence mattered more than he wanted to admit. Ethan took the second mini-tape from his jacket pocket and slid it into the adapter with careful hands. On the credenza beneath the window sat an old conference recorder with legacy inputs, kept for no reason anyone had questioned because offices like this were museums disguised as power. He connected the adapter, pressed play, and waited. Static came first. Then his father's voice, rougher this time, thinner, speaking as if to himself in the middle of a night too long to survive cleanly. "If Ethan hears this, then I failed to tell him face to face. Caleb is innocent. Richard moved the money through a vendor, tree-tied to offshore maintenance contracts, then routed blame inward before I could freeze it. I confronted him. He said the board would never choose scandal over continuity." Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair behind the desk, not because he meant to sit, but because his legs no longer seemed fully his. On the tape, his father continued. I thought I had time. I did not understand how quickly fear makes men practical. If this reaches my son, then hear me clearly. The company can survive disgrace. It cannot survive a lie at the center of it. The tape clicked softly, then hissed on. Ethan pressed one hand over his mouth and stared at the skyline beyond the glass, but he did not see buildings. He saw Caleb in a courthouse suit that did not fit quite right. His father growing quieter at dinner. Richard standing closer each year, speaking more often, managing more, becoming indispensable in the exact way dangerous men always do. Behind him, Naomi said nothing. She did not rush to fill the silence or soften it. She simply stood in the office of a dead man and let grief arrive with dignity. Ethan looked back at the recorder, then at the box on the table, then finally at Naomi. His voice, when it came, was low and stripped of every layer he usually wore. He was telling the truth, he said. Naomi held his gaze and answered with the gentleness of someone who understood that confirmation could break a person more cleanly than doubt. Yes, sir, she said. He was. For a long moment after the tape stopped, neither of them moved. The office held the silence the way a church holds candle smoke. Gently, completely, as if even the air understood something sacred had just been uncovered. Ethan sat behind his father's desk with one hand still near the recorder, the other resting flat against the worn leather blotter where so many decisions had once been made in certainty. Now certainty felt like the most dangerous luxury a man could afford. Across from him, Naomi stood near the low table with the archive box at her side. Her cleaning cart just inside the door, a bright yellow spray bottle catching the afternoon light in a way that seemed almost cruel. Such ordinary objects. Such ordinary proof that truth had not entered his life through a lawyer or a board member or a trusted advisor. It had entered on rubber wheels with a maintenance badge. Ethan lifted his eyes to her. Your mother, he said, the words rough in his throat. What was her name? Naomi answered without hesitation. Laverne Brooks. The name settled into the room like it had always belonged there. Ethan searched his memory and found nothing. That hurt more than he expected. 11 years in his building. Years of passing through corridors his family owned, cleaning offices his family valued, carrying other people's dust home on her clothes, and he had never known her name. Naomi looked down briefly, not from shame, but from the effort of returning to a wound she had learned to carry quietly. She worked nights on this floor for a long time, she said. When I was little, she used to bring home stories about the lights in the city and how the windows up here looked like they belonged to another country. She said places like this teach people to whisper their mistakes and announce their success. Ethan listened without interruption. Naomi's voice was soft, but there was structure in it, a discipline built from years of having to tell the truth carefully if she wanted it to survive. The week your brother was blamed, she came home different. Not dramatic, just smaller somehow. She said she had seen a box move through the maintenance corridor after midnight. She said Mr. Vale caught her looking and told her some people were paid to clean, not think. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief second. The sentence was so precisely cruel, he could hear Richard saying it, not loudly, not theatrically, but with that clipped civility that made humiliation sound like policy. Naomi continued. My mother tried to report what she saw to someone in finance. 2 days later her schedule was cut in half. A week after that, she was written up for missing inventory that was later found exactly where she said it would be. By the end of the month, she was gone. Ethan opened his eyes again. Fired? Naomi nodded. Officially, no. They called it restructuring. But when your rent is due and your hours disappear, the language does not matter much. The truth of that moved through him with the clean edge of a blade. He looked around the office at the shelves of awards, the framed market covers, the leather chair that had once seemed like inheritance made visible, and suddenly the whole room felt haunted by what it had failed to see. I am sorry, he said. The words came out lower than he intended, stripped of executive polish, almost inadequate in their plainness. Naomi studied him for a moment, and what crossed her face was not satisfaction. It was tired grace. I did not bring this to you for an apology, she said. I brought it because your father was trying to fix it, and because lies do not stop with one family. They spread. Ethan felt that land in the center of him. Caleb had lost his name. His father had died carrying truth like a stone he could not set down. Laverne Brooks had lost her job, and Naomi had inherited the silence that followed. Richard had not just protected himself. He had arranged suffering like furniture, carefully, efficiently, wherever it was most convenient. Ethan stood at last. The city outside the glass had shifted into late afternoon, the light colder now, cutting silver across the desk and the edge of the archive box. He reached for the lid and closed it firmly. "You could have ruined me with this," he said. Naomi's hand rested on the cart handle. "Maybe," she answered, "but that would have made me more like him than like my mother." Ethan looked at her then with a clarity he had not possessed that morning. Not as staff, not as a witness, not as a problem, as a person who had every reason to let him fail and had chosen decency instead. He picked up the box, heavier now with everything it meant, and turned toward the door. "Come with me," he said. Naomi gave one small nod. Together they stepped out of his father's office and into the bright executive corridor where glass, power, and expensive silence had protected the wrong man for far too long. By the time Ethan reached the boardroom, the delay had ripened into visible unrest. Through the glass walls, he could see the board members no longer pretending patience. Jackets had come unbuttoned. Water glasses sat half-finished beside untouched signature folders. A woman from investor relations whispered urgently to outside counsel near the far wall. On the media side of the partition, camera operators were adjusting tripods with the strained politeness of people who knew something had gone wrong, but had not yet been told whether to call it scandal or strategy. Richard Vail stood at the head of the table, one hand braced lightly against the back of Ethan's chair, speaking in the measured tone of a man stepping naturally into a vacuum. He looked up when Ethan entered, and for the first time that day the room did not move around Richard. It moved around the box in Ethan's arms and the quiet black cleaner wheeling a cart in behind him. The sight alone fractured the script everyone had been following. Conversations thinned. Chairs stilled. Someone near the end of the table let a pin drop against a legal pad, and the small click echoed louder than it should have. Ethan walked the length of the room without hurrying. Naomi stopped near the wall, her hands resting on the cart handle, not trying to belong there, not apologizing for being seen. Ethan set the archive box in the center of the walnut table, right on top of the acquisition documents. The cardboard edge covered his signature line completely. Richard's face remained composed, but the corners of it had gone tight. "Ethan," he said, his voice calm enough to sound almost kind, "whatever this is, do not do it like this." Ethan looked at him for a long second, then turned to the room. "For 4 years," he said, and the boardroom quieted with the instinctive obedience power still gave him. "This company has operated under a lie. My brother Caleb Whitmore was blamed for financial misconduct he did not commit. My father knew that before he died. He documented it, and the evidence was hidden inside this building." Across the table, one director actually leaned back as if distance might help him process what he had heard. Another pulled off her glasses. Outside counsel stopped writing. Richard gave a short exhale through his nose. "You are making an extraordinary claim based on materials that have not been authenticated." Ethan opened the box. "They have." He laid out the copied memo first, then the archive log, then the corridor photograph. Finally, he placed his phone on speaker and pressed play. The old tape hiss filled the room, thin and brittle, followed by the unmistakable voice of William Whitmore. "Caleb is innocent." Richard moved the money through a vendor tree tied to offshore maintenance contracts. No one spoke while the recording played. No one interrupted. Even the air conditioning seemed to back away from it. When it ended, the silence that followed felt different from all the others that day. This one had judgment in it. Richard straightened slowly. A dead man's private recording and a maintenance worker's story do not overturn governance procedure. Ethan did not sit. He kept both hands on the table, shoulders square, grief and fury held so tightly together they had become clarity. "No," he said, "but the mirrored corridor footage from April 12th does. So does the cloned executive access credential generated from your finance tree. Lena Ortiz has already preserved both. Federal counsel has been notified." That was the moment Richard changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The smile vanished. The warmth drained. What remained was arithmetic. He glanced once toward the door, once toward the board, and saw nothing left to manage. The board chair, a silver-haired woman who had served with Ethan's father for 2 decades, rose slowly from her seat. "Richard," she said, each word precise as cut glass, step away from the table. He did not argue. He simply released a breath and removed his hands from the folder in front of him as two members of corporate security appeared at the doorway beside outside counsel. No one touched him. They did not need to. His power had already left the room. Ethan looked not at Richard, but at the directors who had once nodded through every convenient version of the past. "The signing is cancelled," he said. "Effective immediately. We reopen the Caleb inquiry, release a statement before market close, and begin full cooperation with investigators." Then, after one more beat, he turned toward Naomi. The entire board followed his gaze, finally seeing the woman they had almost stepped around all morning. Ethan's voice lowered, but somehow carried farther. "And for the record," he said, "the person who told the truth first was the one this building trained itself not to notice." The room did not erupt after that. It unraveled. Quietly, papers were gathered with shaking hands. Phones appeared beneath the table, screens lighting faces from below in cold squares. Outside counsel stepped into the hallway to make calls no one in that building had imagined would be made before lunch. Richard Vale left, without looking at anyone, escorted not by force but by the sudden absence of loyalty, and Ethan stood at the head of the walnut table feeling none of the victory a younger, simpler version of him might once have expected. Truth had won, yes, but truth was not clean. It left wreckage. By the time the first draft of the company's statement was circulating and the board had voted to suspend the acquisition indefinitely, dusk had started to gather against the glass. The skyline darkened by inches. One by one, the directors left the room with the drained posture of people forced to realize how much evil had depended on their comfort. Naomi did not stay for any of it. At some point between legal review and crisis calls, she had slipped out the way she had entered Ethan's life in the first place, quietly, without asking to be thanked. He noticed her absence only when the room had gone almost still again, and the yellow spray bottle that had rested on her card all day was no longer catching the light by the wall. A strange emptiness moved through him then. He called Caleb first. The number had not changed, though they had not spoken in almost 8 months. When Caleb answered, his voice came guarded, flat with the kind of distance only family knows how to create. Ethan did not begin with strategy or caution. He began with the words he should have said years ago. "I was wrong." Silence answered him at first, then a breath, then another. Ethan stood alone in his father's office as he told his brother everything. The box, the tape, Richard. Their father's voice carried through old static. He did not spare himself. He admitted the worst part, which was not that he had been deceived, but that he had found deception easier to live with than doubt. By the time the call ended, night had fully settled over Manhattan, and Caleb had said only one thing before hanging up. "Dad tried." Ethan stayed in the office a while longer after that, staring out at the city his family had ruled from glass and certainty for too long. Then, a little after 5 the next morning, unable to sit still inside all that polished grief, he rode the service elevator down to the employee entrance. The building was quieter at that hour, stripped back to its real bones. No investors, no press, just the hum of lights, the sigh of vents, the smell of floor wax and coffee beginning somewhere in a distant break room. He found Naomi in the eastern corridor near the private elevators, a little before sunrise, pushing her cart slowly across the marble as if the previous day had not broken open the entire company. She was replacing the world to order one surface at a time. Ethan stopped a few feet away. She looked up, startled only slightly, then lowered the damp microfiber cloth in her hand. In the pale blue morning light, without the boardroom, without the archive box, without Richard's shadow over everything, she looked younger and more tired and somehow stronger than she had the day before. Ethan noticed details he would once have missed: the faint dryness at her knuckles from cleaning chemicals, the careful stitching repair near the hem of her sleeve, the way she stood ready for dismissal even now, as if good deeds had taught her not to expect gentleness from power. He held out a plain white envelope. This one had her name on it, written in his own hand. Naomi did not take it immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "A formal apology," Ethan said. "Restitution documents for your mother's wrongful termination claim. A promotion offer, if you want one. And a copy of the public statement clearing Caleb." Naomi looked at the envelope, then at him. "You do not owe me a promotion." Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head. "Maybe not. but I owe you the respect of never pretending you were small. Something in her face changed then. Not into a smile exactly. More like a loosening, as if a door inside her had opened just enough to let warmth in. She took the envelope. For a moment neither of them spoke. Dawn gathered slowly through the high glass at the end of the corridor, turning the marble from gray to silver, silver to a faint clean gold. Somewhere behind them, an elevator chimed softly. The building was waking up, but for once it did not feel powerful. It felt human. Ethan looked at the cart between them, at the spray bottle, the folded trash liners, the cloth in her hand, and then back at Naomi. His voice came low, stripped of everything unearned. I was taught to notice power, he said. You taught me to notice truth. Naomi held his gaze for one quiet beat, then nodded once and returned the cloth to the cart. She did not say thank you. She did not have to. She simply moved past him, pushing the cart toward the brightening hallway. And this time Ethan stepped aside before she reached him. He stood there watching the wheels roll over the marble, listening to their soft rhythm fade into the morning, and understood at last that decency did not arrive in a corner office or a board vote or a family name. Sometimes